Picture this: a wooden ship creaking under the weight of the storm, tossed like a toy in the endless black waves of the open ocean. The crew clutches ropes with numb fingers, their lanterns flickering weakly against the howling wind. Somewhere in the dark, the stars have vanished behind thick clouds, and the captain stares at his compass only to realize the needle spins wildly, useless. No landmarks, no guiding lights, just the crushing uncertainty of being utterly, terrifyingly lost. This wasn't just any voyage, this was the nightmare every medieval sailor feared. And yet, against all odds, these sailors didn't just vanish into the abyss. They found their way across thousands of miles of uncharted waters, unlocking the secrets of the seas with nothing but ingenuity, courage, and tools that seem almost magical to us today. How did they do it? That's the mystery we're unraveling today, the astonishing, often overlooked art of medieval navigation. Forget GPS, forget satellite maps. These sailors relied on the whispers of the wind, the dance of the stars, and tools so cleverly designed they border on genius. From the Vikings who read the sun like a compass to the Arab traders who mapped the heavens, the methods they used weren't just practical, they were poetry in motion. And some of these techniques, they're still used by navigators today. But here's the real twist: buried in these ancient strategies are stories of triumph, disaster, and sheer human stubbornness. Think about it: every time a ship vanished without a trace, it wasn't just a tragedy. It was a puzzle that pushed sailors to innovate, to risk everything for the next breakthrough. Today, we're stepping onto the deck of history to uncover how these explorers defied the impossible. You'll never look at the night sky or the open sea the same way again. So, ready to set sail, the secrets of medieval navigation are about to rewrite everything you thought you knew about the age of discovery. In the medieval world, navigation wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. It was the lifeblood of empires, the key to unimaginable wealth, and sometimes the difference between survival and annihilation. Imagine a time when spices from the East were worth their weight in gold, when silk could buy a kingdom's loyalty, and when control of a single trade route could make or break a nation. Without accurate navigation, none of this was possible. Ships laden with treasures from distant lands didn't just sail blindly. They followed carefully guarded knowledge, passed down through generations of sailors who risked everything to map the unknown. Take Venice, for example. This tiny city-state built on a swamp became one of the most powerful empires of its time, not through brute force but through mastery of the seas. Venetian merchants didn't just trade goods, they traded secret charts of hidden currents, safe harbors, and the timing of monsoon winds. One wrong calculation, one misread star, and a ship carrying a fortune in spices could vanish forever. The stakes were so high that navigators were often sworn to secrecy, their knowledge considered as valuable as the cargo itself. Then there were the Portuguese, who turned navigation into a science. Under Prince Henry the Navigator, they pushed farther down the African coast than any European power had dared, not just for glory but for sheer economic survival. Gold, slaves, and ultimately the sea route to India all hinged on their ability to outmaneuver storms, reefs, and rival nations. Every successful voyage tipped the balance of power, fueling wars, forging alliances, and reshaping the world map. But it wasn't just about money. Navigation decided the fate of kingdoms. Think of the Crusades, where fleets carrying soldiers and supplies had to cross treacherous waters under constant threat of enemy ambush. Or the Viking longships, whose lightning raids depended on their ability to appear and disappear with terrifying precision. Lose your way, and you didn't just fail a mission, you doomed an entire campaign. This was a world where a single ship's log could change history, where a captain's ability to read the wind could mean the difference between discovering new lands or being swallowed by the waves. The medieval age wasn't just shaped by swords and sieges, it was written in the stars, carved into the waves, and whispered in the language of the tides. And those who mastered it didn't just sail the seas, they ruled them. When the seas grew dark and landmarks vanished behind the horizon, medieval sailors turned their eyes upward to the silent, steadfast guides that never failed them. The night sky was their map, and Polaris, the North Star, was their compass. Unlike every other star that wheeled across the heavens as the Earth turned, Polaris held its place almost perfectly above the North Pole. Find it and you'd found true north, a fixed point in a spinning world, but mastering the stars was far from simple. Imagine a storm rolling in, clouds swallowing the sky whole. Suddenly, every constellation, Orion's belt, the Big Dipper, even Polaris itself, vanished like snuffed candles. In those moments, even the most seasoned navigator faced a terrifying void. And what happened when ships ventured south of the equator? Polaris, the trusty anchor of northern skies, slipped below the horizon, leaving sailors in uncharted waters with unfamiliar stars. The Vikings had a brutal solution. They'd wait, stranded for days under overcast skies. They watched for the faintest break in the clouds, a sliver of moonlight or a single star to realign their course. Arab navigators, meanwhile, developed intricate star charts and tools like the camel, a simple wooden rectangle on a string. By holding it at arm's length and aligning the top with Polaris and the bottom with the horizon, they could measure latitude. Miss by a fraction, though, and you'd sail right past your destination. Celestial navigation demanded more than just tools. It required an intimate dance with time. The stars shifted with the seasons, and sailors had to memorize their cycles like verses of a sacred text. In the Mediterranean, Portolan charts, hand-drawn maps crisscrossed with rune lines, helped bridge the gaps when clouds obscured the sky. But these were closely guarded secrets, often coded or deliberately distorted to mislead rivals. Yet for all its precision, star navigation had a fatal flaw: humanity. Exhausted sailors misread constellations, drunken helmsmen confused Sirius with Vega, and sometimes the sky itself played tricks, like the eerie glow of St. Elmo's fire, mistaken for divine intervention or doom. The stars were reliable, but the people following them, not always. That's why the greatest navigators never relied on the heavens alone. They combined stellar readings with the whispers of wind, the color of the water, even the flight patterns of birds, because in the end, survival wasn't about one tool. It was about reading the world like a language, one where every wave and cloud and star told a story. Among the treasures of medieval navigation, one tool stood above the rest, not for its simplicity but for its sheer brilliance. The Astrolabe, a disc of brass or wood etched with intricate markings, was the closest thing a sailor had to a GPS in the Middle Ages. Picture this: a device small enough to hold in one hand, yet capable of unlocking the secrets of the heavens. At its core, the Astrolabe worked by measuring angles specifically, the angle between the horizon and a celestial body like the sun or a star. Hold it up, align its sighting mechanism, and suddenly the vast, unknowable sky became a precise mathematical grid. Here's how it worked in practice. A navigator would suspend the astrolabe by its ring, letting it hang vertically. Then they'd rotate the movable pointer, called the alidade, until its two sighting holes framed the North Star or the midday sun. The angle read from the scale carved along the edge revealed their latitude, their position north or south of the equator. It was a deceptively simple concept with profound implications. For the first time, sailors could calculate their location even when coastlines vanished from view, turning the open ocean from a realm of guesswork into something measurable. But the astrolabe's genius didn't stop there. Versions used on land doubled as astronomical calculators, predicting star positions, tracking time, even determining prayer times for Muslim scholars. The mariner's astrolabe, though stripped down for rough sea conditions, retained this multi-layered intelligence. Imagine a captain in the 15th century, battered by waves, squinting through salt spray to take a reading. Every wobble of the ship threatened his accuracy, yet the data he pulled from that brass disc could mean the difference between reaching Lisbon or drifting into oblivion. The tool wasn't flawless, of course. Stormy skies rendered it useless, and rough seas made precise measurements nearly impossible. Even on calm days, a slight misalignment could throw off calculations by miles. But when it worked, it was revolutionary. Portuguese explorers like Vasco da Gama relied on astrolabes to navigate the treacherous waters around Africa's Cape of Good Hope, plotting courses that reshaped global trade. Without it, Europe's age of discovery might have stalled at the coastline. What made the astrolabe truly remarkable, though, wasn't just its function, it was its legacy. This was a device born from centuries of cross-cultural exchange, refined by Greek astronomers, perfected by Islamic scholars, and adapted by European sailors. It symbolized something greater than navigation, humanity's relentless drive to make the unknown knowable. And though modern GPS has replaced it, the astrolabe's spirit lives on, in every satellite that guides us, every map that charts the unseen. Because at its heart, navigation has always been about more than tools. It's about the audacity to look at the stars and say, "Tell me where I am." While the astrolabe was a marvel of medieval engineering, not every sailor had the patience or the steady hands to master it. Enter the quadrant, a smaller, simpler cousin of the astrolabe, but no less brilliant in its design. Picture a quarter circle of wood or metal, marked with degrees along its curved edge and fitted with a weighted plumb line. To use it, a navigator would sight the North Star or the Sun along one edge while the plumb line swung freely, its position against the scale revealing the angle of elevation in an instant. No complex adjustments, no delicate balancing acts, just a quick, reliable reading, even on a deck pitching in stormy seas. What made the quadrant so valuable wasn't just its simplicity, it was its resilience. Unlike the astrolabe, which demanded precise alignment and calm conditions, the quadrant could tolerate the chaos of the open ocean. Sailors wrestling with wind and waves needed tools that wouldn't fail them mid-voyage, and the quadrant delivered. Portuguese explorers racing down the African coast often relied on it when their astrolabes became unmanageable. Its lightweight design meant it could be easily stowed, pulled out for a hurried reading, and tucked away again before the next wave hit. But the quadrant's real genius lay in its adaptability. Versions like the backstaff, developed later, let sailors measure the sun's height without staring directly into its blinding light, a common hazard with earlier tools. By turning their backs to the sun and using shadows cast on the instrument scale, navigators could take readings without scorching their eyes. It was a small tweak with life-saving consequences. Imagine a ship off the coast of Brazil, its crew exhausted from days under a relentless sun. With the quadrant, they could confirm their position without adding blindness to their list of dangers. Yet for all its advantages, the quadrant wasn't perfect. Cloud cover still rendered it useless, and human error, a misread angle, a shaky hand, could skew results as much as any storm. That's why the smartest navigators never relied on just one tool. They carried quadrants for rough weather, astrolabes for calm nights, and the wisdom to know when to trust each. The quadrant didn't replace the astrolabe, it complemented it, offering a quicker, dirtier solution when precision took a backseat to survival. In the end, these tools weren't competitors, they were partners in the same daring quest. Whether it was the quadrant's rugged simplicity or the astrolabe's refined precision, each played its part in unlocking the oceans, and together they whispered the same promise to every sailor who dared to use them: you are not lost. You are found. Sometimes the bravest thing a sailor could do was admit they had no idea where they were, then keep sailing anyway. This was the essence of dead reckoning, the art of calculated guesswork that carried ships across trackless oceans when stars, tools, and landmarks failed. Picture a captain hunched over a candlelit chart, marking his last known position before the skies darkened. From that moment on, every calculation was a gamble. He'd note the ship's speed measured by tossing a log overboard and counting how fast it passed between two marks on the deck. He'd track direction with a compass, however unreliable in storms. And he'd mark time with an hourglass, each grain of sand a tiny betrayal as currents and winds pushed the ship invisibly off course. Dead reckoning wasn't just imprecise, it was a high-stakes game of drift. A minor error in speed or direction multiplied over weeks could leave a ship hundreds of miles from its intended landfall. The consequences ranged from inconvenient to catastrophic. In 1588, the Spanish Armada's dead reckoning failed so spectacularly that entire squadrons of warships smashed into Ireland's rocky coast, believing they'd reached safe harbor. Yet when it worked, the results were nothing short of miraculous. Christopher Columbus relied almost entirely on dead reckoning during his first voyage, scribbling one set of numbers for his nervous crew and a secret, more accurate log for himself. His gamble that the crew's mounting terror wouldn't outpace his own miscalculations. The Vikings took dead reckoning to its daring extreme. Without compasses or astrolabes, they navigated the North Atlantic by reading waves, wind patterns, and even the color of the water. A change in ocean temperature signaled the edge of the Gulf Stream. A sudden swell might hint at distant land. Their secret weapon, the sunstone, a crystal of Icelandic spar that polarized sunlight, revealing the sun's position even through thick clouds. Combine that with their keen observation of migratory birds, and you had a system so effective it let them reach North America 5 centuries before Columbus. But dead reckoning's greatest irony was this: its failures often led to history's greatest discoveries. In 1500, Pedro Alvarez Cabral's fleet, bound for India, drifted so far off course they accidentally bumped into Brazil. Similarly, Dutch traders blown off route in 1610 stumbled upon Australia's west coast. These mistakes redrew the world map, proving that sometimes being lost was the only way to find something new. Yet for every happy accident, there were countless tragedies. The doomed expedition of La Perouse in 1785 vanished without a trace after his dead reckoning failed in the Pacific, leaving only shattered wreckage and unanswered questions. Even seasoned navigators like James Cook, who meticulously cross-checked dead reckoning with celestial observations, faced moments of chilling uncertainty. The ocean didn't forgive errors, and neither did hungry crews when their captain's guesses left them adrift with dwindling supplies. What made dead reckoning endure wasn't its precision, but its stubborn humanity. It was sailors accepting that the sea would lie to them, and choosing to outwit it anyway. Every scratched mark on a chart, every corrected course was a defiance of the unknown. And in that defiance lay the heart of navigation, not just tools or stars, but the courage to keep moving when the world refused to show its way. Picture a map so valuable, so precise, that kings would wage wars to control it, not for the land it depicted, but for the sea routes it revealed. This was the power of the Portolan chart, the medieval navigator's most prized possession. Unlike traditional maps cluttered with mythical beasts and fanciful geography, Portolans were ruthlessly practical. They ignored inland kingdoms entirely, focusing instead on coastlines, harbors, and the spiderweb of room lines radiating from compass roses. These lines weren't just decorative, they were the highways of the sea, showing sailors exactly how to steer from Lisbon to Alexandria or Venice to Constantinople with terrifying accuracy. Creating a Portolan chart was an act of both art and obsession. Master cartographers painstakingly compiled centuries of sailor knowledge, every hidden reef, every safe anchorage, every cove where freshwater could be found. They worked on stretched sheepskin, its surface treated to resist moisture, using inks mixed with ground minerals for durability. The coastlines were drawn free, and yet achieved near-modern precision, often accurate to within 20 miles. How? Because these weren't theoretical exercises. Each curve of the shore was verified by pilots who'd sailed it, their lives depending on its truth. But the real magic lay in those room lines. Unlike modern maps aligned to true north, Portolan's used magnetic north, accounting for the very compass deviations that could doom a voyage. Sailors would stretch threads across the chart, lining them up with the radiating lines to plot their course. Miss by a single degree, and the thread might lead to disaster. Follow it faithfully, and even a novice could navigate like a seasoned captain. The system was so effective that some Portolan charts from the 1400s still outperform early printed maps of the same regions. Of course, such power couldn't be left unguarded. Portolan charts were state secrets, locked in chests or chained to tables in admiralty offices. Venetian law punished anyone caught smuggling them with amputation. The Spanish crown employed blind draftsmen to copy charts, men who could memorize coastlines by touch but couldn't betray what they'd never seen. Even legitimate copies were often deliberately distorted, with fake islands or mislabeled capes to sabotage rivals. When the Ottoman admiral Polaris compiled his legendary world map in 1513, he boasted it contained secrets not found in any other map, a claim backed by his use of purloined Portuguese and Spanish charts. Yet for all their precision, Portolans had one glaring flaw. They were useless beyond the shoreline. Venture into the open ocean, and those meticulously drawn coasts vanished, leaving sailors dependent on stars, dead reckoning, and sheer nerve. This limitation reveals the chart's true purpose. They weren't just maps but mercantile manifestos. Their focus on ports and trade routes underscored a brutal truth. In the medieval world, knowledge wasn't about exploration. It was about control. Whoever mastered the chart mastered the wealth that flowed along its inked paths. The legacy of these charts echoes in every digital map we use today. Google Maps may replace parchment with pixels, but its core function remains unchanged: to turn the chaos of the world into something navigable. The Portolan makers understood this instinctively. They didn't just draw coastlines, they distilled centuries of human experience into a single, irreplaceable truth, that to map the world is to hold its destiny in your hands. And that kind of power, it's always worth fighting for. Before the compass, sailors navigating under cloudy skies were effectively blind. They might guess their direction by the swell of the waves or the scent of land carried on the wind, but these were desperate measures prone to heartbreaking error. Then, like a bolt from the blue, the magnetic compass arrived in medieval Europe, carried by traders who traveled the Silk Road from China. Imagine the shock of European mariners when they first saw this miraculous device, a sliver of magnetized iron floating on water or balanced on a pin, pointing unerringly north no matter how the ship rolled or the clouds gathered. Suddenly, the invisible force of the earth itself became their guide. The Chinese had known about magnetism for centuries, possibly as early as 200 BC, using spoon-shaped lodestones for divination before adapting them for navigation. By the time the technology reached the Mediterranean in the 12th century, Arab and Persian sailors had already refined it into something resembling the modern compass. European sailors, though late to the party, recognized its potential instantly. Here was a tool that didn't just supplement celestial navigation, it made the stars optional. Now, even when fog smothered the horizon or storms blotted out the sky, a captain could keep his course. But how did it actually work? At its core, the compass exploited a simple but profound truth: the Earth is a giant magnet. The needle aligned itself with the planet's magnetic field, its iron atoms acting like microscopic arrows, all pointing toward magnetic north. Early versions were crude, a magnetized needle stuck through a straw floating in a bowl of water, yet staggeringly effective. Later designs mounted the needle on a pivot inside a protective case, often marked with the cardinal directions or even intricate wind roses. The genius of the compass wasn't complexity, it was reliability. Unlike astrolabes or quadrants, it required no calculations, no clear skies, just the steady pull of the planet itself. This reliability came with quirks, though. Magnetic north isn't the same as true north, a fact that caused confusion and shipwrecks until navigators learned to adjust for the difference, known as magnetic declination. Worse, iron fittings on ships could distort readings, sending needles spinning wildly unless placed carefully away from interference. And in the Arctic, where magnetic fields grow erratic, compasses became nearly useless. Yet even with these flaws, the compass revolutionized sailing. Portuguese explorers like Vasco da Gama depended on it to push farther down Africa's coast, while Columbus's crews, though terrified of sailing off the edge of the world, took grim comfort in that unwavering needle. What made the compass truly transformative, though, was how it democratized navigation. Before its arrival, celestial navigation required years of training. Reading the stars was an art passed down through elite guilds. The compass changed that. Even an illiterate deckhand could grasp its meaning. This shift didn't just improve navigation, it shattered monopolies. Venetian and Genoese navigators could no longer hoard secret star charts when any rival with a 10-cent needle could match their course. Trade routes opened, empires expanded, and the balance of power tilted on the pivot of that tiny, spinning needle. Yet the compass's greatest legacy might be psychological. For the first time, sailors could stare into a featureless gray horizon and feel certainty. That assurance, the knowledge that even when the heavens went dark, they weren't truly lost, gave them the courage to sail beyond the edges of their maps. And in that courage lay the seeds of the modern world, because every empire that rose from the age of discovery, every culture forever altered by global trade, every idea that crossed oceans, all began with a simple truth: sometimes the most revolutionary tools aren't the ones that show us the way. They're the ones that make us brave enough to look for it. The ocean has its own language, a silent grammar of wind and wave that medieval sailors learned to read like a sacred text. Unlike stars or compasses, these cues couldn't be held in the hand or etched onto brass. They existed in the slant of the wind, the temperature of the water, even the way seabirds circled overhead. Master navigators didn't just sail on the sea, they listened to it, and nowhere was this dialogue more critical than in harnessing the trade winds, those mighty planetary breath currents that dictated the fate of empires. Take the Portuguese caravels probing down Africa's coast in the 1400s. Their captains noticed something uncanny. Southbound voyages were agonizingly slow, fighting headwinds for weeks, yet the return trip north was astonishingly swift, as if the ocean itself was pushing them home. The secret, the North Atlantic gyre, a vast clockwise current spinning like a liquid treadmill. By dropping south to catch the Canary Current, then swinging west into the trade wind's steady easterlies blowing toward the equator, ships could ride an invisible conveyor belt to the New World. Miss the timing by a month, though, and you'd be battling hurricanes instead of breezes. The Arabs had cracked this code centuries earlier. Their dhows with lateen sails that could pivot like a falcon's wing exploited the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean with breathtaking precision. From November to March, northeasterlies carried them to East Africa. Come April, the winds reversed, sweeping them back to Arabia and India laden with ivory, gold, and spices. This wasn't just navigation, it was a celestial dance, synchronized with seasons as reliably as the harvest. One medieval Arab pilot's manual put it bluntly: "He who ignores the monsoon is a fool." The wind will either bury him or beggar him, but mastering these patterns demanded more than memorization. It required a visceral connection to the environment. Basque whalers could smell the Labrador Current, a cold, plankton-rich flow that signaled prime hunting grounds. Polynesian navigators tasted the sea, detecting faint freshwater seeps from distant atolls. And Viking sagas speak of windstones, rocks that supposedly changed color based on humidity, hinting at approaching storms. Some historians suspect these were Iceland spar crystals, revealing polarized light patterns invisible to the naked eye. The trade routes we take for granted today, the spice lanes of the Indian Ocean, the triangular Atlantic crossings, weren't arbitrary. They were wrested from nature's grip through generations of trial and catastrophe. When Columbus stumbled upon the Americas, it wasn't pure luck. He'd pored over Portuguese wind charts showing how the Azores high-pressure system could catapult ships westward. Magellan's circumnavigation, only possible because his pilot, a Malay named Enrique, recognized the Pacific's doldrums, windless zones where ships could languish for weeks unless they carried extra provisions. Yet for all their sophistication, these techniques had a cruel edge. The same currents that carried slave ships from Africa to the Americas made escape nearly impossible for the enslaved. The winds that enriched Europe's empires also spread colonization like a stain. Nature's guideposts were neutral, human ambition wrote the destinations. And that's the haunting paradox of wind and current navigation. It was both a triumph of observation and a tool of conquest, proof that the sea's language could be used for poetry or profit, depending on who held the tiller. Long before satellites or sonar, the sea's creatures were the most reliable guides a lost sailor could hope for. Medieval navigators knew something modern science has only recently confirmed. Birds and whales aren't just passing travelers. They're living compasses, their behaviors etched with clues to land, currents, and storms. Picture a Portuguese caravel 3 weeks out from the Azores, its crew gaunt from dwindling rations. Then, a miracle, a lone tern circles the mast, its wings dipping toward the southwest. To the desperate men, that bird wasn't just a scavenger, it was a promise. Where there are terns, there are fish. Where there are fish, land can't be far. The Vikings took this further, codifying bird watching into an art. Their sagas speak of ravens carried in cages aboard longships. When fog obscured the sun, they'd release a bird. If it circled aimlessly, no land was near, but if it flew straight as an arrow, the crew would row hard in that direction, trusting the raven's keener senses to spot what human eyes couldn't. One Icelandic chronicle tells of a ship saved from certain doom when its raven led them to the Faroe Islands after days adrift. The technique was so reliable that Norse explorers used it to colonize Greenland and even reach Newfoundland, 1,000 years before ornithologists understood migratory patterns. Whales, too, were unwitting navigators. Basque whalers working the North Atlantic noticed something peculiar. Certain species, like the right whale, followed precise routes between feeding and breeding grounds. A pod surfacing off starboard might mean the Grand Banks were near. Their absence warned of treacherous open ocean. Polynesian navigators went deeper, interpreting whale songs as acoustic maps. The deeper the tones, the closer to underwater seamounts where currents swirled predictably. One Tahitian legend describes a voyage where every crew member had given up until the captain, pressing his ear to the hull, heard the resonant clicks of sperm whales moving toward sheltered lagoons. He followed the sound, and by dawn, palm trees dotted the horizon. But wildlife navigation wasn't just about geography. Birds signaled weather shifts with uncanny accuracy. Albatrosses flying low meant storms brewing. Their sudden disappearance predicted calms that could strand ships for weeks. English fishermen off Newfoundland watched gannets dive. If they surfaced empty-beaked, it signaled cold upwellings that could freeze rigging overnight. The wrong interpretation could be deadly. In 1592, a Spanish galleon ignored the frantic flight of shorebirds ahead of a hurricane, only to be smashed against the Florida Keys. The real genius of these methods lay in their simplicity. No brass instruments, no complex charts, just the sharp observation of creatures who'd mastered the sea's rhythms long before humans dared to sail it. And though we've traded ravens for radar, the legacy of these techniques endures. Modern sailors still heed the sudden gathering of seabirds, knowing that even in an age of satellites, nature's signs remain the oldest and often the wisest maps of all. The sagas speak of them, magical crystals that revealed the sun's position even when the sky was thick with clouds. Viking sunstones sound like something ripped from fantasy, yet modern science suggests there's startling truth behind the legend. Imagine a Norse longship battling the North Atlantic's fury, the horizon lost in grey mist. Without landmarks or visible stars, the crew would pull out a translucent stone, holding it to the sky. As they rotated it, patches of light would shift across its surface, aligning to betray the hidden sun's location. It wasn't sorcery, it was physics, harnessed by sailors centuries before anyone understood polarization. These sunstones, likely made of Icelandic spar, work because of how certain crystals filter sunlight. Even on overcast days, sunlight retains faint polarization patterns, invisible to human eyes but detectable through the stone's prism-like structure. By rotating the crystal until the brightness on both sides matched, navigators could pinpoint the sun's position with eerie accuracy. In 2011, a team of Hungarian researchers put this to the test. Using a replica sunstone under overcast Arctic skies, they calculated the sun's location within 5 degrees, close enough to correct a ship's course after days of dead reckoning. But were Vikings really using these stones, or is this just wishful thinking? The evidence is tantalizing but indirect. No sunstone has ever been found aboard a Viking wreck, yet a chunk of Icelandic spar was recovered from a 16th century English ship sunk off the Channel Islands, proof that medieval sailors valued such crystals. Even more compelling are the Vikings' own staggering navigational feats. They crossed the North Atlantic to places like Newfoundland with consistency, despite the region's infamous fog. Celestial navigation alone couldn't explain that precision, but a sunstone could. Critics argue that the sagas mentioning sunstones were written centuries after the Viking Age, leaving room for exaggeration. Yet practical tests keep tipping the scales toward reality. In 2018, Danish researchers sailed a replica Viking ship from Norway to Newfoundland using only period-appropriate tools, including a sunstone. For 18 days of cloud cover, the crystal gave them their only reliable bearings. The crew didn't just reach their destination, they proved it was possible without a single clear sunrise. What makes the sunstone debate so fascinating isn't just whether Vikings used them, it's what their existence says about medieval ingenuity. This wasn't blind luck, it was observation honed into toolmaking. The same people who crafted brutal axes also mastered light subtleties, turning a quirk of mineralogy into a lifeline. That duality captures the Viking paradox. They weren't just raiders but relentless problem solvers. And if a crystal could cheat the clouds, what other secrets did they take to their graves? When visibility failed and the stars offered no clues, sailors turned to the oldest navigational trick in the book, listening to the whispers of the deep. The lead line was their lifeline, a deceptively simple tool that transformed a length of rope and a lump of lead into a window to the ocean floor. Picture a sailor heaving the weighted line overboard, counting the knots as it unspooled into the darkness. The moment the lead hit bottom, the rope went slack, and suddenly the featureless sea gave up its secrets. Depth was just the beginning. By pressing tallow into a hollow at the lead's base, the line returned with a sample of the seabed, sand, shell, or sticky clay, each texture a breadcrumb leading home. This was sounding in its purest form, part measurement, part detective work. Mediterranean pilots memorized charts listing depths and bottom types for every harbor approach. A sudden shift from sand to pebbles might mean the mouth of the Nile. Black mud signaled the Tagus River near Lisbon. Norse navigators in the North Atlantic listened for the lead's clunk. Rock meant open sea, while muffled thuds warned of fjord silt. The technique was so precise that Venetian galley captains could identify their position within miles just by tasting the tallow. The sharp tang of certain sediments was unmistakable. But sounding wasn't just about safety, it shaped history. In 1488, Portuguese explorers probing Africa's coast felt their lead line suddenly go slack after plummeting 200 fathoms. They'd struck the Guinea abyssal plain, a depth so vast it revealed they'd rounded the continent's bulge, unlocking the sea route to India. Later, Dutch East India Company ships used systematic soundings to map the Sunda Strait. their lead lines threading between coral heads like fingers feeling for a key in the dark. The tools evolved, but the principle endured. By the 18th century, British naval surveyors added armed leads, weights wrapped in wax to capture precise seabed impressions. One captain in the Caribbean even trained his crew to distinguish between coral types by sound alone. Brain coral clicked while elkhorn groaned under the lead's weight. These weren't just tricks, they were survival skills. When Admiral Nelson blockaded Toulon, his ships maintained position for months using nothing but lead lines and memory, proving that sometimes the oldest tools outwit the cleverest foes. Yet for all its elegance, sounding had brutal limits. Storm waves could yank the line from a sailor's grip mid-cast. Icy ropes numbed fingers until knots became unreadable. And in the deep ocean, where the abyss swallowed leads whole, the technique was useless. That's why the greatest navigators treated sounding not as a crutch, but as one voice in a chorus. Combined with stars, currents, and the cry of gulls, the humble lead line whispered the same timeless truth. The sea gives clues to those who know how to ask. Even the best maps and instruments were useless when a ship approached the labyrinth of reefs, sandbars, and shifting currents guarding a foreign harbor. That's when captains turned to the real masters of coastal navigation, local pilots. These were men who knew the waters like their own heartbeat, who could read the swirl of a tide or the color of the waves like a language. In an age before lighthouses and buoys, their knowledge wasn't just helpful. It was the thin line between a profitable voyage and a shipwreck. Take the approach to Venice, a city seemingly designed to drown the unwary. Its lagoon hid sandbanks that shifted with each storm, channels that twisted like snakes, and tides that could trap a galley for weeks. Only Venetian pilots trained from childhood in secret schools knew the true paths. They'd board incoming ships miles offshore, their presence so vital that refusing a pilot was a crime punishable by seizure of the vessel. Their fee, often a percentage of the cargo's value, a price merchants paid gladly, because what good was a hold full of spices if your ship lay splintered on the wrong sandbar? The English Channel had its own guardians. Here, the Cinque Ports pilots ruled hereditary navigators who passed down tidal secrets through generations. They could smell a coming storm in the salt air, knew exactly when the infamous Goodwin Sands would emerge to strangle ships at low tide. Their charts were mental, their landmarks ephemeral, a particular way the current rippled around a submerged rock, the cry of certain seabirds near Dover's cliffs. In 1588, when the Spanish Armada blundered into the Channel, it was their lack of local pilots that doomed them. English ships, guided by men who knew every fathom, danced around the invaders like shadows. But pilots weren't just human GPS systems, they were diplomats, spies, and sometimes pirates. In the Ottoman Empire, pilots licensed by the Capudan Pasha held monopolies on guiding Christian ships through the Dardanelles. Many doubled as intelligence gatherers, reporting cargo manifests to the Sultan's tax collectors. Malay pilots in the Straits of Malacca carried knives along with their tide charts. Some were rumored to steer fat merchant ships into ambushes. And in the Caribbean, Spanish pilots deliberately misled enemy vessels onto reefs, a tactic so common that British captains began kidnapping rival pilots to ensure safe passage. The true measure of their worth, even kings bowed to their expertise. When Portugal's Manuel I wanted to break the Venetian monopoly on Indian spices, he didn't just build better ships, he poached Arab and Gujarati pilots, offering fortunes in gold for their knowledge of monsoons and coral atolls. Centuries later, when Napoleon planned his invasion of England, his admirals begged him to delay not because of the Royal Navy, but because they lacked enough French pilots who understood channel tides. The mightiest armies were helpless without these unsung masters of the shallows, yet for all their power, pilots lived on the edge of disaster. One misjudgment, one moment of fog shrouded confusion, and their reputation along with their ship could sink forever. The annals of maritime courts are filled with trials of pilots who guessed wrong, their defense always the same: the sea changed its mind, because that was the cruel truth of their craft. The waters they knew so intimately were never truly knowable. Every high tide rewrote the map, every storm buried old landmarks and birthed new ones. To be a pilot was to dance with a partner who kept changing the steps, and yet, against all odds, they led countless ships safely home. Knowledge was power, but in the age of sail, it was also gold, empire, and survival. That's why Europe's greatest maritime nations didn't just train navigators. They built entire universities of the sea where celestial mechanics met state secrets. At the forefront stood Portugal's legendary school of sagas, perched on the windswept cliffs of Cape St. Vincent. Founded by Prince Henry the Navigator in the early 1400s, this wasn't just a school, it was a fortress of discovery where mathematicians, astronomers, and hardened ship captains huddled over charts lit by candlelight. Here, the stars weren't just studied, they were weaponized. The curriculum at Sagas read like something between a spy novel and a physics textbook. Arab navigators, lured from North Africa with promises of wealth, taught the intricacies of the camel and astrolabe. Jewish cartographers, fleeing persecution elsewhere in Europe, brought star tables refined in Cordoba's observatories. Even Italian shipbuilders were recruited, their knowledge of Mediterranean caravels adapted to withstand Atlantic gales. But the crown jewel, the Padro's secret rudder's navigational logs, that Portuguese captains were required to update on every voyage. These weren't just journals, they were encrypted treasure maps detailing currents, landmarks, and safe harbors from Senegal to Sumatra. One wrong word leaking to Castile or Venice, and Portugal's monopoly on the African gold trade could vanish overnight. Secrecy wasn't just policy, it was life or death. Students at Sagas swore blood oaths never to share their training. Maps produced there were deliberately falsified for foreign eyes, with phantom islands sketched into the Atlantic to waylay competitors. When the Portuguese explorer Diogo Cao carved stone markers along Africa's coast in 1482, their inscriptions gave only vague hints of his route, enough to stake a claim, but never enough to guide a rival. Even the school's physical layout was a maze of guarded courtyards and isolated towers, designed to keep prying merchants or spies from overhearing a captain's briefing. Yet Sagas wasn't alone in this shadow war of knowledge. Venice's Scuola dei Mercanti trained pilots in a language so obscure, even most Italians couldn't decipher it, a coded dialect blending Greek, Arabic, and Venetian slang. Spain's Casa de Contratación in Seville locked its master charts in a chest with 3 separate keys held by different officials. And in the Ottoman Empire, the Capudan Pasha's Naval Academy in Istanbul taught celestial navigation using poems' mnemonic verses that could be memorized and destroyed if enemies boarded. The irony, this obsession with secrecy often backfired spectacularly. When Portugal guarded its African route too fiercely, Spain gambled westward, accidentally stumbling into the Americas. The Dutch, frozen out of Iberian knowledge, reverse-engineered Portuguese navigation manuals captured from a wrecked carrack in 1592, jump-starting their own golden age of exploration. And the most devastating leak of all, the German cartographer Martin Behaim, who studied at Sagas before selling its secrets to Nuremberg's merchants, effectively arming Portugal's competitors. What these schools understood painfully, gloriously, was that navigation wasn't just about mathematics or stars. It was about control. Whoever charted the waves ruled them. And in the end, the greatest discovery wasn't a new continent or spice route. It was the terrifying, exhilarating truth that knowledge, once let slip, could never be caged again. When the stars went dark and the compass spun wildly, sailors didn't just rely on tools, they turned to the heavens themselves. Navigation wasn't just a science, it was a covenant with the divine, a desperate plea whispered into the teeth of a storm. Every ship had its patron saint carved into the mast, painted on the sails, because crossing the ocean wasn't just dangerous, it was blasphemous. who dared to challenge God's domain without protection. Spanish galleons carried shrines to the Virgin of Guadalupe, her image believed to calm waves. Portuguese caravels invoked Saint Elmo, his eerie blue fire on the mast seen as a sign of favor. And woe to the crew who neglected their prayers. Ship logs from the age of exploration are littered with wrecks blamed on divine wrath for skipping mass. But faith alone couldn't soothe every fear. Sailors clung to rituals so specific they bordered on obsession, launching a ship on a Friday, unthinkable, the day Christ died. Bringing bananas aboard, certain doom, a superstition so pervasive that British naval records show captains throwing entire cargoes overboard after a streak of bad luck. Even the act of renaming a vessel required elaborate ceremonies to confuse vengeful spirits. The sea was alive with omens. A dolphin following the ship meant good fortune, while a shark in the wake signaled impending death. Some crews refused to let redheads on board unless they spoke first, believing their silence cursed voyages, a prejudice that lingered well into the 19th century. Then there were the miracles, or the stories spun to sound like them. In 1588, as the Spanish Armada fled English fireships, survivors swore they saw the Virgin Mary guiding them through the fog. A century later, a British frigate in the Caribbean reported an entire choir of angels singing from the rigging during a hurricane, their voices drowning out the wind. Whether divine intervention or delirium, these tales became gospel among sailors. More chilling were the curses, like the infamous Flying Dutchman, doomed to sail forever after its captain blasphemed against the storm. Even pragmatic admirals like Horatio Nelson carried talismans. His lock of hair sewn into his uniform was less sentimental charm than spiritual armor. The darkest rituals emerged when hope ran out. The doldrums, windless zones where ships could languish for weeks, drove crews to madness and worse. Accounts speak of sailors drawing straws to decide who'd be sacrificed to summon wind, their bodies tossed overboard as offerings. During the Batavia's disastrous wreck in 1629, survivors descended into cannibalism and murder, convinced God had abandoned them. These weren't just tragedies, they were cautionary tales etched into maritime lore. Ships began carrying Bibles not for comfort, but as legal protection, proving crews had appealed to heaven before resorting to unthinkable acts. What makes these beliefs so haunting isn't their strangeness, but their logic. When the sea refused to obey rules, sailors created their own. Every prayer, every taboo was an attempt to impose order on chaos, to bargain with forces beyond human control. And in that struggle, they revealed a truth more profound than any star chart. That navigation wasn't just about finding the way, it was about surviving the journey with your soul intact. For centuries, sailors didn't just fear storms or reefs, they feared the sky itself. Celestial myth wrapped the heavens in terror, turning simple stars into omens of doom. None struck deeper dread than the idea of the equator, a fiery belt rumored to boil the ocean and melt ships. Ancient Greek geographers like Ptolemy wrote of an uninhabitable torrid zone, where the sun's fury would ignite the very air. Arab maps marked the equatorial line with dragons, their tails coiled around boiling whirlpools. Even seasoned Portuguese captains, hardened by Atlantic gales, hesitated when their astrolabes neared 0 degrees latitude. What if the legends were true? This wasn't just superstition, it was a wall of fear built from half-truths. Early traders venturing south along Africa's coast returned with tales of unbearable heat, their descriptions warped by each retelling. By the time these stories reached Europe, they'd morphed into nightmares, accounts of seawater bubbling like cauldrons, of wooden hulls bursting into flame at midday. The irony, these myths sprouted from real phenomena. Near the equator, the doldrums, windless zones where ships could languish for weeks, left crews stranded under a blistering sun. Barrels of water did sometimes overheat, pitch between planks could soften to tar. But instead of seeing these as navigational challenges, terrified sailors wove them into a cosmic boundary, a line where God had drawn the limits of man. The consequences were catastrophic. For decades, European ships clung to timid routes along Africa's northern coast, missing the trade winds that could have propelled them south. When Portuguese explorer Diogo Cao finally crossed the equator in 1482, his crew nearly mutinied, convinced their blood would boil in their veins. Their relief at surviving unscathed didn't just disprove the myth, it shattered a psychological barrier. Within years, Portuguese caravels were sailing clear to the Cape of Good Hope, their captains laughing at the old fears. But the equator wasn't the only celestial lie. Polaris, the steadfast North Star, bred its own dangerous assumptions. Mediterranean sailors believed it marked true north universally, until Arab traders pointed out its gradual drift over centuries. Worse, some Norse navigators insisted the aurora borealis could guide ships, its shimmering curtains supposedly aligning with magnetic fields. More than one Greenland-bound vessel vanished following those ghostly lights straight into icebergs. Even the moon played tricks. Medieval texts described moon dogs, phantom companion moons said to appear during certain phases. Sailors spotting these rare atmospheric halos sometimes altered course, mistaking them for land-reflected light. The most tragic cases, Spanish galleons in the Caribbean, lured onto reefs by the illusion of calm waters under the false moon's glow. What makes these myths so haunting isn't their inaccuracy, but the ingenuity behind them. They weren't just ignorance, they were attempts to explain a terrifyingly vast world with the scraps of knowledge available. And in that struggle, they reveal a truth more profound than any star chart. Sometimes the greatest barriers to discovery aren't the oceans or the winds, but the stories we tell ourselves about them. The most skilled medieval navigator could chart a course with painstaking precision, only for the sea to laugh in his face. For all their ingenuity, sailors of this era were forever at the mercy of forces beyond human control. A perfectly calculated route using the stars might be obliterated by a week of storms, while a trusted current could vanish without warning, leaving ships stranded in windless purgatory. Even the best tools had fatal flaws. Astrolabes wobbled uselessly on storm-tossed decks. Compasses deceived when iron cargo distorted their needles, and dead reckoning, that careful tally of speed and direction, crumbled the moment an unseen current pulled a ship miles off course. Weather wasn't just an inconvenience, it was the great liar of the seas. Sudden squalls in the Mediterranean could snap masts like twigs, while the infamous horse latitudes near the equator becalmed ships for so long that crews reportedly threw livestock overboard to conserve water, hence the name. The Viking sagas tell of ships trapped in Arctic ice for entire winters, their crews surviving on seal blubber while the stars they'd relied on wheeled uselessly overhead. Even predictable winds like the trade winds could turn traitor, as Portuguese sailors learned when their caravels designed to sail brilliantly against the wind were suddenly helpless when the wind died entirely. Then there were the silent killers, miscalculations so small they seemed harmless until they multiplied over weeks at sea. A misread star by just 2 degrees might mean missing Lisbon by 100 miles. A slightly overestimated speed could land a ship on the wrong side of Africa. The consequences weren't just embarrassing, they were deadly. In 1522, Magellan's fleet miscalculated the breadth of the Pacific, leaving them adrift for 98 days with crews reduced to eating sawdust and rat hides. Some ships simply vanished, their last logged positions becoming grim riddles. The Mary Rose, Henry Roman VIII doomed warship, likely sank because her pilot misjudged the tide's pull near Portsmouth, a mistake measured in feet but fatal all the same. Perhaps the cruelest limitation was time itself. Celestial navigation required clear skies, but the heavens rarely obliged on demand. Polynesian voyagers sometimes waited weeks for a single glimpse of the stars to correct their course. In northern waters, winter meant months of unbroken darkness, turning the best navigators into blind men guessing at landmarks. and when desperation forced sailors to move without guidance, the results could be catastrophic. The Dutch ship Batavia, wrecked off Australia in 1629, had been sailing under overcast skies for days when it struck a reef, not because the crew was reckless, but because the clouds refused to part. Yet for all these dangers, the greatest risk wasn't in the tools or the weather. It was in human nature. Exhausted crews misread instruments. Captains ignored pilots' warnings to avoid appearing weak. Greed pushed ships to sail overloaded or in forbidden seasons. The Lisbon to Goa route was littered with wrecks because merchants insisted on squeezing just one more monsoon crossing, even when seasoned navigators begged them to wait. The sea didn't drown these ships, arrogance did. In the end, every medieval voyage was a bargain with uncertainty. Sailors might have the finest astrolabes, the sharpest pilots, the most detailed charts, but the ocean always had the final word. What's astonishing isn't how many ships were lost, but how many against all odds found their way. And in that tension between skill and chaos, calculation and luck, lay the true drama of the Age of Sail. The sea has no mercy for miscalculations, a truth the Portuguese Carac São João learned in blood and fire. In 1552, this towering ship, laden with spices and ivory from India, began what should have been a triumphant return to Lisbon. But as it rounded the Cape of Good Hope, a cascade of errors sealed its fate. The captain, trusting outdated charts, misjudged the Agulha's current, a ferocious flow that pushed the ship far off course. Then, when storms shredded the sails, the crew's crude astrolabe readings wobbled with each violent pitch of the deck. By the time they spotted land, they weren't near friendly Mozambique as planned, but stranded on the wild coast of modern-day South Africa. What followed was a nightmare. Survivors marched hundreds of miles through hostile territory, their ranks thinning daily from thirst, lion attacks, and skirmishes with local warriors. Of the 600 souls aboard, fewer than 20 lived to tell the tale. The São João wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was a symptom of an era where ambition outpaced knowledge. Spanish Admiral Pedro de Mendoza's fleet, bound for the Rio de la Plata in 1535, lost 10 of 13 ships because their pilots confused the estuary's shifting sandbars. The Dutch Batavia, wrecked off Australia in 1629, ran aground after its arrogant captain ignored the navigator's warnings, preferring his own flawed dead reckoning. And then there was the infamous White Ship disaster of 1120, where Henry I of England lost his air because the drunken crew couldn't distinguish star reflections from actual harbor lights in the moonlit channel. What makes these failures so illuminating isn't just the scale of the loss, but how they forced innovation. The São João's wreck spurred Portugal to establish mandatory checkpoints along the African coast where ships could recalibrate their navigation. Spanish Cosa de Contratación began compiling derroteros, detailed logs of currents and landmarks after too many fleets vanished in the Caribbean, and the Batavia tragedy led the Dutch East India Company to mandate dual navigation teams on every vessel, one to chart the course, another to verify it. Yet the greatest legacy of these disasters was psychological. They shattered the myth of infallibility. After centuries of treating navigation as a mix of guesswork and divine favor, sailors began demanding rigor. The very tools we associate with medieval navigation, the refined astrolabe, the cross staff, even the humble logbook, were honed in the fires of these catastrophes. Because sometimes progress isn't born from success, but from the bitter certainty that the sea will always punish arrogance. And in that harsh lesson, these lost ships found an unexpected immortality, not as cautionary tales, but as the unwitting architects of a safer age of sail. By the twilight of the Middle Ages, a quiet revolution was unfolding in the hands of navigators, one that would shatter the limits of the known world. The cross staff, a deceptively simple tool born from this era, became the bridge between medieval guesswork and Renaissance precision. Picture a wooden staff about 3 feet long with a sliding crosspiece that could measure the angle between the horizon and the sun or a star. Unlike the Astrolabe, which demanded calm seas and steady hands, the cross staff worked even when the deck pitched beneath a sailor's feet. Portuguese explorers racing down Africa's coast relied on it to take rapid readings. Its design so intuitive that even a cabin boy could be trained to use it. But its true brilliance lay in its adaptability. Slide the crosspiece closer for high noon sun measurements, extend it for dim evening stars. This wasn't just a tool, it was a democratization of navigation, putting celestial calculations within reach of anyone willing to learn. Yet the cross staff had a dangerous flaw. Staring directly at the sun to align it could blind a navigator in moments. The solution, the backstaff, its ingenious successor. Developed in the late 1500s, this device let sailors measure the sun's height by casting its shadow onto a scaled arc. No more scorched retinas. English navigator John Davis perfected the design, allowing ships like those of the East India Company to venture deeper into southern latitudes without losing half their crew to eye injuries. The backstaff's secret was its dual scales, one for the sun, another for the horizon, each fine-tuned to cancel out the ship's rocking motion. Suddenly, even under storm-threatened skies, a navigator could snatch a reading between cloud breaks with life-saving accuracy. While these tools sharpened celestial navigation, another innovation was quietly transforming how ships stayed on course: the dry compass. Early compasses had been temperamental, their needles floating in water that sloshed with every wave, their lodestone magnets losing potency over time. But by the 1400s, European craftsmen began suspending needles on finely balanced pivots inside sealed wooden cases. Filled with air instead of water, these dry compasses resisted stormy conditions and could be mounted near the helm for real-time course corrections. The Venetians took it further, inventing the compass rose a circular card marked with 32 directional points that rotated atop the needle. Now, even in pitch darkness, a helmsman could hold a steady bearing by candlelight. The impact of these tools rippled far beyond the technical. With reliable compasses and cross staffs, captains could dare routes previously deemed suicidal. Vasco da Gama's 1497 voyage around the Cape of Good Hope wasn't just bravery, it was math. His fleet carried the latest Portuguese compasses, their needles tempered to resist the southern hemisphere's magnetic quirks. Columbus, though famously wrong about the distance to Asia, trusted his cross-staff readings enough to defy mutinous crews, and when Magellan's surviving ship limped home in 1522, its logs revealed a chilling truth. Without the backstaff's precision in the Pacific, the entire expedition would have vanished like so many others. What made these late medieval advances so revolutionary wasn't just their mechanics, it was the mindset they embodied. No longer were sailors at the mercy of folklore or frail instruments. The cross-staff's geometry, the compass's steadfast needle, the backstaff's clever optics all whispered the same promise: the sea could be mastered. And as these tools spread from Lisbon's shipyards to Amsterdam's docks, they carried with them the seeds of a new era. The age of exploration didn't begin with a single voyage or king's decree. It began when ordinary sailors could look at the heavens, glance at a compass, and say with certainty, "I know where I am." And in that knowing lay the power to change the world. Hidden beneath the floorboards of countless ships, locked in iron chests with rusted keys, lay the real treasure of medieval navigation. Not gold or spices, but handwritten logs so valuable their pages could buy a man's silence for life. These weren't just records, they were living maps scrawled with corrections and curses in equal measure. Each smear of ink earned through storms, starvation, and hard-won experience. A captain's log might note the exact phase of the moon when a particular current ran strongest off the Cape of Good Hope, or the strange color of the water that signaled hidden reefs near Malacca. But the most crucial details, those were often written in code, a mix of cipher, sailors' slang, and outright lies to foil spies. Venetian logs used dialect words known only to their guild pilots, while Portuguese rutters inserted phantom islands to mislead rivals who stole them. One surviving log from a 15th century Genos galley marks a vital freshwater spring on the North African coast with a tiny drawing of a laughing devil, a warning that the spot was either poisoned or too precious to share. The art of log keeping was a ritual as precise as celestial navigation itself. Every noon, the ship's master would note the day's run, how many leagues they'd covered, the wind's direction, even the mood of the crew. But between these dry entries lurked secrets only initiates could decode. Arabic pilots along the Indian Ocean trade routes used margin notes in rhyming verse, their cadence helping memorization. Norse captains carved runic symbols into wooden sticks, their notches recording tides and ice conditions too sensitive to trust to parchment that might wash overboard. And then there were the wine logs of Mediterranean merchant ships, accounts written in grape juice that turned visible only when heated, revealing smuggling routes or bribes paid to Ottoman customs officials. Passing these logs down wasn't just tradition, it was survival. In Lisbon's maritime courts, wills often bequeathed navigation journals with more ceremony than land or titles. A famed pilot named Duarte Pacheco Pereira left his son not just his Astrolabe, but a logbook containing 20 years of corrections to Portuguese charts, each error marked with a drop of his own blood to underscore its cost. The Arabs took it further, with families like the Ibn Majids of Oman guarding logs like heirlooms for generations. Ahmad ibn Majid, the legendary Lion of the Sea, credited his grandfather's logs for teaching him how to ride the monsoons between Arabia and Zanzibar, their margins crammed with notes like, "Beware the red water here, it does not sparkle at dawn like true channels." Yet these logs carried a grim duality. For every voyage they guided safely home, they also lured others to disaster. When the Spanish captured a Portuguese carrack in 1587, they seized its rutters believing them to be infallible, only to wreck 2 ships following outdated notes about Caribbean coral reefs. The Dutch East India Company lost an entire fleet off Australia because their coppered logs failed to note how the roaring 40s currents had shifted over decades. And in the darkest cases, logs became weapons. After English privateer Francis Drake ransacked a Spanish treasure ship in 1579, he deliberately left behind falsified logs suggesting a non-existent northern passage back to Europe. The next Spanish fleet that tried it, their frozen hulls still litter the coast of Oregon. What makes these journals so haunting is their intimacy. Unlike cold, official charts, they pulse with human fear and triumph. You can still see the tremor in a captain's handwriting when he records losing sight of land for the first time, or the pressed flowers tucked between pages by homesick sailors marking the day they turned toward home. They remind us that behind every great discovery lay not just tools and stars, but men who stared into the abyss and dared to write down what they saw, knowing full well others might follow their words to glory or the grave. Pirates didn't just steal treasure, they stole knowledge, hijacking the very science of navigation to turn the seas into their hunting grounds. Take Blackbeard's infamous blockade of Charleston in 1718. While merchant ships clung to predictable trade routes, his crew lurked just outside the shipping lanes, using stolen Portuguese rutters to anticipate their victims' paths. But here's the twist: pirates rarely truly navigated. They didn't need to. Instead of plotting bold courses across uncharted waters, they lurked like wolves near coastlines and choke points, exploiting the disciplined navigation of others. A naval explorer's astrolabe might measure the stars. A pirate's best tool was a spyglass trained on the horizon, waiting for some overburdened merchantman to sail into view. The difference between pirates and explorers wasn't just morality, it was methodology. Naval captains like James Cook meticulously logged currents, winds, and landmarks, adding to humanity's collective knowledge. Pirates, their logs, if they kept them at all, were filled with shortcuts and stolen waypoints. Spanish treasure fleets sailing from Havana to Cadiz could predict their journey down to the day thanks to celestial calculations. The pirates who ambushed them relied on crude tactics, trailing fishing boats to hidden inlets, bribing harbor pilots for intelligence, or worse, capturing a ship's navigator and torturing the route out of him. When Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground in 1718, investigators found his charts were a patchwork of plagiarized fragments, some deliberately falsified to mislead rivals. Yet pirates weren't entirely lawless in their seamanship. Some, like the notorious Bartholomew Roberts, enforced strict rules aboard ship, including fines for mishandling navigation tools. His crew's ability to outmaneuver British frigates off West Africa came from a twisted pragmatism. They'd seize a ship's instruments but keep its navigator alive just long enough to exploit his skills. Others, like Chinese pirate Queen Qing Shi, ran fleets so vast they needed systemized navigation, employing defected Ming Dynasty admirals to chart their campaigns. But even these exceptions proved the rule. Piracy thrived on disrupting order, not creating it. The legacy of pirate navigation is a paradox. They produced no groundbreaking tools, no refined star charts, just chaos. But in their ruthlessness, they exposed the fragility of the era's maritime systems. Every captured ship revealed how reliant global trade was on a handful of vulnerable routes and predictable patterns. Naval explorers expanded the map. Pirates proved how easily it could be weaponized. And that's the uncomfortable truth lurking beneath the romantic tales of Jolly Rogers and buried gold. Sometimes the greatest threat to progress isn't ignorance. It's someone watching from the shadows, learning just enough to exploit the ones who dared to discover. The Astrolabe didn't just cross oceans, it crossed civilizations, a silent witness to the greatest intellectual handshake in maritime history. Picture a 12th century Sicilian port where Arab traders haggled with Norman sailors over silk and spices. But the real treasure changing hands wasn't in the cargo holds. It was in the weathered notebooks of Andalusian scholars, filled with star tables and diagrams. Among those pages, the design for an instrument that would reshape Europe's understanding of the heavens, Astrolabe in Arabic, soon to be known across Christendom as the Astrolabe. This wasn't mere trade, it was the transfer of centuries of Islamic astronomy and mathematics, gifted to a continent still clinging to folklore about sea monsters at the world's edge. The Islamic world had already refined celestial navigation to an art form long before Europeans left sight of their coastlines. Arab navigators like Al-Khwarizmi, whose name gives us the word algorithm, had mapped the heavens with trigonometric precision, while Persian shipmasters used camels to measure latitude along the Indian Ocean's monsoon highways. When these techniques reached Venice and Lisbon through ports like Alexandria and Palermo, they didn't just fill gaps in European knowledge, they exploded them. Suddenly, Mediterranean pilots could reconcile their crude coastal charts with mathematical certainty, calculating positions using the same trigonometry that had guided Muslim pilgrims to Mecca for generations. China's contribution was quieter but no less revolutionary. While European sailors struggled with magnetic compasses that faltered in storms, Chinese junks had been using dampened needles suspended in oil since the Song dynasty, a design Arab traders carried westward. The Portuguese, quick to recognize superior technology, adapted these compasses for their caravels, pairing them with Arab star charts to navigate the open Atlantic. It was a fusion of East and West that turned the ocean from a barrier into a bridge. Yet this exchange wasn't always peaceful. When Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498, his pilots relied on an Arab navigator kidnapped from East Africa, a man forcibly recruited at sword point to guide the Portuguese through monsoon winds he'd spent a lifetime mastering. The same knowledge that had once connected cultures now became a weapon hoarded by empires. Spanish cosmographers in Seville's Casa de Contratación pored over captured Arabic rutters, redrawing maps with stolen coordinates while labeling the originals, "Here be dragons," to discredit competitors. What made this cultural collision so transformative wasn't just the tools, but the mindset behind them. Islamic astronomy treated navigation as sacred geometry, a way to honor creation by understanding its patterns. Chinese pilots saw harmony between celestial movements and terrestrial currents, a philosophy woven into their magnetic compass designs. When Europe inherited these ideas, it weaponized them for conquest, yet the legacy endured. That astrolabe passed from Arab hands to European ones didn't just change navigation. It proved that progress has no native language, no single homeland. The sea, in the end, was the first true global classroom. History remembers the great navigators as men, brave, weathered captains guiding ships into the unknown. But the truth is far more complex. Behind every legendary voyage were women who defied the rigid constraints of their time to leave their mark on the age of sail. Take Jeanne Barré, the French botanist who became the first woman to circumnavigate the globe, but only by stitching herself into men's breeches, binding her chest, and signing on to Bougainville's expedition in 1766 as Jeanne. For months, she outwitted the crew, collecting plant specimens by day and sleeping in a locked storeroom by night. When her identity was finally revealed, likely after Polynesian islanders recognized her immediately, she wasn't celebrated. She was threatened with abandonment on the nearest shore. Only Bougainville's reluctant protection saved her. Barré's story is extraordinary, but she wasn't alone. In the shadows of port towns and royal courts, women shaped navigation in ways official records often erased. Arab and Persian sailing manuals mention female astronomers who calibrated astrolabes in coastal observatories, their star tables smuggled aboard ships by male relatives. Norse sagas whisper of fjord witches, elderly women who interpreted wave patterns and bird migrations to guide fishing boats through fog-choked inlets. Even Columbus's voyages relied on maps copied by nuns in Lisbon's convents, their meticulous calligraphy preserving details male scribes dismissed as trivial. The barriers these women faced weren't just social, they were legal. Maritime codes from Venice to Canton explicitly forbade women on ships, citing everything from bad luck to fears they'd distract crews. English naval regulations classified women discovered aboard as stowaways, punishable by marooning. The irony, many of these rules were written by men who couldn't navigate without the very knowledge women preserved. In medieval Iceland, where men were often lost at sea for months, it was wives who maintained the family's Landnámabók property logs tied to celestial markers that guided husbands home. Some women didn't just break barriers, they weaponized them. Grace O'Malley, the 16th century Irish pirate queen, exploited superstitious fear to dominate the Atlantic trade routes. Knowing rival captains would avoid attacking a ship with a woman aboard lest they curse their own voyage, she flaunted her presence on deck, her crimson cloak a deliberate provocation. Then there were the anonymous light wives of Baltic fishing villages who kept signal fires burning on headlands, their flames aligned with constellations to guide boats through treacherous archipelagos. They weren't navigators by title, but their understanding of the night sky was often sharper than the men who depended on it. The greatest tragedy isn't that women were excluded from navigation, it's how much was lost in their exclusion. When the Spanish crown ordered all ship logs burned after Magellan's circumnavigation to protect trade secrets, they didn't consider the indigenous women in the Philippines who'd piloted the fleet through the Spice Islands using tidal songs. Portuguese destroyers raising Swahili port cities in the 1500s didn't account for the matriarchs who'd memorized monsoon winds in rhyming couplets, their knowledge passed mother to daughter like heirlooms. We'll never know how many discoveries were delayed, how many ships might have been saved had the world listened to voices it refused to hear, yet traces remain if you know where to look. In the margins of a 14th century Catalan atlas, a woman's handwriting corrects the longitude of the Canary Islands. In the sigils of Venetian glassmakers, daughters encoded safe harbor depths into family crests. And in the quiet defiance of Jean Barre, who, after surviving her voyage, demanded and received a royal pension for her botanical work, proving that even in a world determined to erase her, some stars could not be extinguished. The glowing screen of a smartphone, quietly calculating your position within feet, feels like a world away from medieval sailors squinting at astrolabes under stormy skies. But strip away the sleek interface, and the DNA of today's navigation systems pulses with centuries-old ingenuity. When your GPS pinpoints a coffee shop in seconds, it's echoing principles those sailors carved into wood and brass, just at the speed of light instead of the turn of the stars. Take the humble compass, that spinning needle pointing north on your hiking app. It's a direct descendant of the magnetized lodestones medieval Arabs floated in bowls of water. The difference, instead of relying on Earth's magnetic field alone, modern systems use a web of orbiting satellites to triangulate position, but the core idea of aligning to an invisible force remains unchanged. Even the eras have lineage. Just as iron cargo messed with medieval compasses, today's smartphones can falter near power lines or steel buildings, proving some problems outlast centuries. The stars themselves still guide us, though now we've moved them into space. The global positioning system relies on atomic clocks aboard satellites, essentially artificial stars whose positions are meticulously tracked, much like Polaris was mapped in medieval star tables. When your phone receives signals from 4 satellites, it's performing a high-tech version of what Viking navigators did with their sunstones, calculating angles to determine location. The math is fancier, but the geometry identical. What medieval sailors would envy most, though, is our ability to cheat time, dead reckoning. That gamble of estimating position based on speed and direction was fraught with drift. A week of storms could leave a ship hundreds of miles off course. Modern inertial navigation systems used in jets and submarines face the same challenge. But with gyroscopes and accelerometers so precise they can detect the Earth's rotation, it's dead reckoning on steroids, correcting itself thousands of times a second. Yet for all our advances, we've lost something too. Medieval navigators read the sea like a living thing, the taste of the water, the flight of birds, the way waves broke differently near unseen shoals. Today's systems, for all their precision, are deaf to these nuances. When the USS Guardian ran aground in the Philippines in 2013, investigators found its digital charts hadn't been updated to reflect coral growth, a mistake a 15th century pilot might have avoided by spotting the telltale color of shallow water. Perhaps the most profound legacy lies not in the tools but in the mindset they created. Medieval navigation demanded collaboration, Arab star charts blended with Chinese compasses, Venetian maps corrected by Norse whale lore. Similarly, GPS is a mosaic of technologies: American satellites, German engineering, Japanese microchips. The dream that drove sailors to risk everything that the world could be mapped, measured, and connected is the same one that beams driving directions to your dashboard. So next time you glance at that little blue dot on your screen, remember, it's not just satellites overhead. It's the ghost of every sailor who ever trusted a needle in the dark, every explorer who looked at the stars and dared to ask, "Where am I?" The answer just comes faster now. When we look back at the daring voyages of medieval sailors, it's not just their tools that astonish us, it's their nerve. To cross oceans with nothing but a wooden compass, a hand-carved astrolabe, and scraps of star charts took a kind of courage that borders on madness. These weren't just explorers, they were alchemists turning uncertainty into discovery, fear into legend. Every voyage was a gamble against an indifferent sea, where a single misread current or cloud-covered sky could erase them from history. Yet somehow they carved trade routes out of chaos, stitching continents together with nothing but intuition and ingenuity. Think about the Viking longships slicing through North Atlantic fog with nothing but a sunstone and the flight patterns of birds. Or Arab traders riding the monsoon winds across the Indian Ocean, their camels measuring latitudes with the precision of a modern GPS. These weren't just feats of navigation, they were acts of defiance. The ocean didn't give up its secrets willingly. Every technique, every tool was wrested from failure. Ships vanished, crews starved, empires rose and fell on the back of a single captain's ability to read the waves. And that's the real magic of this story. It's not just how they navigated, it's why. For spices, for gold, for God, yes, but also for the sheer, stubborn thrill of proving it could be done. When Portuguese sailors finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope, they weren't just opening a trade route. They were proving that the world was bigger, stranger, and more connected than anyone had dared to dream. So here's to the Astrolabe makers, the star chart thieves, the pilots who memorized tides by the taste of the water. They didn't just cross oceans, they taught us how to see the world as a place of endless possibility. And now we want to hear from you. What's your favorite hidden gem from the Age of Sail? A forgotten tool, a daring voyage, a navigator who defied the odds? Drop your pick in the comments because history's greatest stories are always the ones we share.